Do 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 do. Yep, it looks like it's time for another worst to best. This video series that I look at one specific either artist or band and rate all of their albums that they released from their worst to their best. And this time we're looking at the progressive rock darling of Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant and I have a very strange relationship. They took on the aspects of progressive rock that I, at the time, didn't appreciate. I didn't really like all those jazzy movements. I didn't really like that inaccessible experimentation. The thing that I came to progressive rock for were the longer stretches of music, the big climaxes that they would create, kind of more of the symphonic approach, as opposed to the strange time signatures, the very avant-garde approach, because they were very tight. Now, after, acquiring the taste, so to speak, I have subsequently fallen in love with this band. I love the quirky aspects of them, I love the fun atmospheres that they bring, and I love the celebratory nature of the band as well. I love how they never shy away from trying new things and keeping it interesting. And that's definitely one of the kind of taglines of the band, is keeping it interesting. So we shouldn't really get bogged down too much about the history of the band. They formed in 1970, disbanded in 1980, had a good 10-year run. Sort of. So anyway, let's get into this. As with all of these, a few housekeeping notes. First off, this is my own personal opinion. I'm not saying that this is the definitive list. I'm not saying that number 1 is the absolute best. I'm not saying that number 11 is the absolute worst. I'm just saying that if all of them were laid out in front of me, which one would I listen to first and which one would I listen to last? And similarly, these aren't going to be like really in-depth reviews. I'm going to give like a quick kind of context of why it is where it is, maybe bring out some highlights from it, as well as some negatives. And I think that's about it. All right, let's dive in with arguably their worst album, at least within my eyes. Number 11, The Missing Piece, released in 1977. Yep, now I know a lot of people wouldn't say that this is their absolute worst album. Some people actually kind of enjoy this one, but for me, they had like an identity crisis at this point. 1977 was a very strange year for progressive rock. Still quite a bit of strong prog works going on, but it was definitely a very strange transitional year where prog was just like, we don't really know what to do. And that is emulated perfectly on The Missing Piece. They did their best to kind of try to keep their identity of that jazzy, avant-garde, fun-loving, interesting album. A lot of these songs are still like avant-garde-ian approach, very proggy, very jazzy, but it's too bombastic to be more of like the easy listening that they would put out after this. The only song that I can actively remember after listening to this album a handful of times is 2 Weeks in Spain, and even that track is, if this track was on any other album, it would be the weakest by far. This would be a snooze fest album for me if it wasn't so bombastic and headache inducing as well. So yeah, The Missing Piece should have stayed lost. All right, let's move on to the next one. Number 10, Interview, released in 1976. Yeah, this is the album that came out just before The Missing Piece, and a lot of people would still say that this is a pretty good album, pretty strong album. But for me, it suffers the same kind of thing that The Missing Piece was suffering. The thing that does bring it up, though, is that it is still interesting. It is still engaging at points. I don't feel like I am actively rushing to turn off the radio when I'm listening to this one. And you can also hear the band still trying to maintain their identity in it. Like, they haven't quite lost that touch. But you can also start to tell that this is the beginning of the end for the band. Even though I like the general concept that structures the album, in that it's like an interview between the band and this publication of sorts, kind of like what Rolling Stone and Billboard was doing at the time, of like interviewing bands and kind of like putting them up on this pedestal and making them bigger than they were. So that I kind of appreciate and I kind of like, and they have a lot of songs that are very tongue-in-cheek in that sense. That doesn't save those tracks that are bad, because unfortunately when the songs are bad, they are very bad. They're forgettable, they don't have any kind of fun atmosphere to it. The opening track of Interview for me is the highlight, and after that it does kind of just suffer and waver a little bit. Unfortunately within this one, the worst that I can say is that it's boring and it's not quite as bombastic as The Missing Piece. So we have that going for it. But yeah, it's just kind of one that I can do without. So yeah, let's move on. Number 9, Giant for a Day, released in 1978. So this album isn't as bad as I originally thought it was. I had done a Fallen from Grace video of this and kind of ripped it apart because this album isn't that bad. It's, in my mind, not even their worst, as it's number 9 on this. There are a few tracks on here that I genuinely really like. Spooky Boogie is quite a delightful little song. Thank You and Friends are very heartfelt. They're much more genuine than anything that we found on Interview or The Missing Piece. Like, it's definitely the most devious of all Gentle Giant albums in terms of what makes Gentle Giant. Like, the jazzy, avant-garde, proggy pieces are all but pretty much gone in replacement for more accessible, straight-up rock, radio-friendly tracks. And where many would say that this is a like a weakness and a bad thing, I don't mind it because it's fun. It's very enjoyable music. Like, I can listen to this without running to turn off the radio. I mean, obviously the weaknesses are that it's lost all of the complexities and sophistications of their songwriting ship in terms of their music and melodies and harmonies. Like, honestly, I could see that they held out as long as they could within this viewpoint, but in 1978, people were definitely turning their noses down to prog, so I could see them changing with the times, and I don't demonize them for it. And at the end of the day, the album is still kind of forgettable in that sense. Like, it doesn't really have a clear identity either, outside of just a bunch of accessible rocky songs. Yeah, I mean, it's, at the end of the day, it's still an enjoyable listen, but it's not what we come for Gentle Giant. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 8, Civilian, released in 1980. That's right, their final album, Civilian. I have to admit, this was the album that I knew least about. Like, all the other albums I have in my collection in either tape form, CD form, or vinyl form, this is the only one that I don't own. It's a little bit harder than Giant for a Day, which elevates it a little bit more. The songs are a little bit more accessible, a little bit more poppy. They also have that catchy atmosphere within it. There are a few tracks that I can really dig, like Number 1 is really fun, and All Through the Night is actually quite a delicious treat. It also feels like a little bit more of an obligation at this point. Like, I could tell that the band isn't quite as invested in it as they were for, say, Giant for a Day. But again, what puts it over the top for me in terms of this one is that they still go for it even if their hearts aren't in it, and it's a little bit more engaging than, say, Giant for a Day. So this album isn't all that bad, but I wouldn't go to it first by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, let's move on now to more of the core. The albums after this are the ones that I would call more definitive Gentle Giant, and I think at this point we're going to get into some hot takes and some controversial opinions. So this is a little bit of a warning sign for anybody that's about to get butthurt, but let's dive in. Number 7, The Power and the Glory, released in 1974. So this was the first album that I owned on vinyl for the band, and I have to admit, this was one of those once bitten, twice shy kind of an idea, because I listened to this album on vinyl when I got it, like, first or second year university, and I was just turned off. Like, there are only 2 really big songs on this album that I like, and that's Aspirations and Playing the Game. Playing the Game is probably my favorite track off of this album. I feel like it's a little too much for me. I feel like Power and the Glory is just a little too sharp. It doesn't have that same kind of fun or energizing or engaging listens. This one's more of like a sophistication. It's much more of a sit down and analyze kind of an album. And I feel like the singing styles off key are a little too much for me. It's still a strong album, if nothing else. This continues the trend that we had already seen with Octopus and In a Glass House. The band is getting much tighter in their playing as well. This is probably the band at their peak in terms of integration of musicianships. Their experimentation with the vocal harmonies and how it plays with polyrhythms on here is something really to be admired. I just wish I enjoyed it a little bit more. I can understand and appreciate the appeal of this album. At the end of the day, it's just not for me. And that's really what it kind of comes down to. Yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 6, Freehand, released in 1975. Again, I can understand why people love this album. I like this a little bit more than The Power and the Glory. I feel like it's a little bit more well-rounded. I feel like there's a little bit less analyzing and over sophistication, and like I don't need a calculator when I'm listening to this one. It does have one of my favorite tracks by the band, which is Just the Same, but I also feel like this album does have a lot of songs that just kind of fall flat for me. And after the Freehand, like after we get to the title track of the Freehand, the album does start to go downhill, at least again for me. Tracks like Time to Kill, His Last Voyage, was it Talboyant and Mobile? They all kind of feel like songs that we've already heard before. The album actually starts off really, really strong with, as I said, Just the Same. On Reflection is really, really a strong track. And then the Freehand. So those first 3 tracks are just they have that perfect blend of complexity, of sophistication, of joyous atmosphere, that avant-garde fun times, with also being a little bit more on the accessible side. We have a little bit more of an entry point for the tracks at this. Yeah, this album is the very definition of a mixed grab bag. If you put this on shuffle, you're either going to get something great or something bad. It's a reason why I put this one as kind of the midpoint within the career. This is, yeah, it's either really, really good or really, really bad. So let's move on to the next one. Number 5, Acquiring the Taste, released in 1971. Their sophomore album, their second album. This, if, say, Gentle Giant's Giant for a Day was their most devious one way, then Acquiring the Taste is the most deviant on the other end. This album is probably the least accessible of all their albums, and that includes the crazy avant-garde what the hells that we will get later on. It's very like atmospheric. It's very like you're trying to grab onto whatever the rhythm or melodies or whatever's going on, and it's just really odd and dark and strange, and I love it. I just love this album. In my notes, there's a hell of a lot of strengths compared to a little bit more of the weaknesses. So let's get through the weaknesses first. Even though I love the fun approach and the really strange and quirky atmosphere of this album, it does take a long time to get into. I mean, Acquiring the Taste is a very accurate and descriptive title for this overall work. You can get lost in the fold within this album. It's definitely a lot less fun, but it's not quite to the same like pen, paper, and calculator as, say, The Power and the Glory was. So into the strengths. Very passionate work here. You can tell that the boys are gunning for something very special and very strong, and they definitely accomplished that. The house, the street, and the room. Such a strong and passionate track on this. Like, that rhythm section and that harmonizations that we have that bombastic singing style with such a groove and song work, and where that song goes, it's just so much fun. Plain Truth being another one. I'm just like, yep, this is it. This is it. This is one of the albums that actually really got me into Gentle Giant and proved to me that, hey, I have a gateway into this, so I can really ride that for here. It still has that rocking aspects. We have a lot of those really lead guitar moments, and it's all blended together very, very well on this album. I can definitely see, again, why people love this album, why people don't like this album, but I love this album. I think it's a great time. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 4, In a Glass House, released in 1973. Now, again, I know people love this album, and I do as well. I think this album wasn't actually released officially in North America. I think it was just a UK release, and you had to like import it here. I love this album. Love this album. Although I do feel like the first side is far better than the second side. And that first side, which has The Way of Life and Inmate's Lullaby, both of these tracks are just so strong, and how this album also opens up is very, very strong. But I do see how this is a little bit weakened with the second side. And even though the songs on the second side aren't necessarily the best work that the band has done, I can still like listen to it all the way through without ever really having to like push pause or push skip. And it's everything that I love from a Gentle Giant album. It's sophisticated, it's bopping, it's got some great bangers on it, it's complex. So now we're coming into the final three. You know, we're coming into like the, if we had our score sheet coming on, we've eliminated most of them. So as I get closer and closer, we're going to find out what number one is. But let's talk about number three, because this one holds a very special place in my heart. Number 3, Gentle Giant, released in 1970. Their debut self-titled release. I love this album. This one might have been my favorite, most enjoyable listen. I love how accessible this album is. I love how more rocky it is, how hard-hitting it is. We're not quite as all over the place. It's not quite as jazzy or avant-garde or experimentation that we have later on. It is a solid release though, from start to finish. Funny ways, being quirky and strange. Nothing at all is that banging, and it flows perfectly into Why Not. I love how strong and how hard those final tracks are off of this album. Really, it's really hard to say any of the weaknesses. Like, up to this point, I could always kind of pick out one or two weaknesses. I could always kind of expand upon those. But yeah, the only thing I can kind of say is you can still see the band is trying to figure out who they want to be. Even for a debut album, and even for this kind of wandering a little bit of who they want to be, there's still a very real identity that's found on this album. So even that downplay and that weakness, it still doesn't hold quite a lot of water, but I had to find something, right? I had to be critical about this. And the strengths are just how solid the tracks are. Like, song for song for song, this album is extremely solid and extremely well constructed. So yeah, Gentle Giant would be a perfect place for that, for anybody to start from the outskirts that knew nothing about this band. So yeah, let's move on to the final two. Number 2, Octopus, released in 1972. Yep. Even though this was probably the first album that I listened to and heard from the band, I mean, I had the CD way back in the day, it grew on me, and how could it not? All of these songs are bangers. Like, each of these are their own little mini magnum opus in some sense, and I mean, there's 8 of them, so Octopus. I wonder if they did that on purpose. Oh my gosh, I'm just getting that now. Yep, they totally did that on purpose. All the albums that came out before, they were flirting with, you know, kind of that jazzy, fun aspect, but this one, they dove into it. Gone are the big flourishes of the guitar work. Gone are the more subtle or atmospheric approaches. This is the sophisticated, avant-garde, jazzy ridiculousness, and I friggin' love it. But honestly, my favorite track off of this is Think of Me with Kindness. This song is so heartfelt, and I gush whenever I listen to this. I always put it on any mix that I'm saying goodbye to somebody to. The only real weakness that I can think of, and the only reason why I didn't put this as number 1, is that I feel it's more of a collection of songs than an album. And I think that was the point going in. Whereas I feel like some of the albums that they had put out and will put out had more of a unifying feature to it. But even that isn't really like a weakness, it's just more of a reason as to why I didn't put it as number 1. It is a staple of any progressive rock collection. That's enough about Octopus. Let's move on to number 1. Number 1. 3 Friends, released in 1972. That's right, we got a double album this year. 1972 saw Octopus as well as 3 Friends. Banger after banger. Their 2 best albums. And the main thing that put 3 Friends over Octopus is that it's a little bit more approachable. It's a little bit more accessible, and it's a little bit more fun. I love the concept of these 3 schoolmates that used to be best friends that have subsequently grown up. Their careers or their lives and their paths, how they differ, and how we all kind of drift apart. Like, each track off this album perfectly represents the theme that they're going for and what those individuals have chosen as their life. Like, the Working All Days got that more of like the hard hitting, the we gotta do this, we're just doing this to get our pay, that we can get home and just relax and all that. Peel the Paint is probably my favorite Gentle Giant song of all time, where it's very like meticulated, very thought out. It's just like the guy's creating, and all of a sudden that creativity is lost, and he's just like, I peel the paint, I look underneath, and he's like, you can feel him like tearing down this creative work, and then finds out that nothing's really been learned at the end of it. Like, it's an expression, but you haven't really learned anything from it. And then Masterclass in Quality, as well as the title track of Three Friends, are just so good. Yeah, love this work. Easily my favorite work of theirs. I love the flow, and that's really what it is. It's the unifying flow of the album that just ties it all together that I can't help but gush about. Brilliant album from them. And that's it. That's all the albums rated from their worst to their best. What did you guys think? What is your favorite Gentle Giant work? What is your least favorite Gentle Giant work? Let me know all of that, as well as how I'm wrong about my own list, by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys, as always, are the best. I love the discussions that we get within these kind of worst to best videos. They're a joy to make, even if they do take quite a bit of time. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.